Everybody beats Trump, except Pocahontas. Hi, I'm Scott Ott, and this is Bill Whittle Now. And Bill, there's a new poll out of registered voters that appeared in the Daily, the Daily Mail from England that shows that basically all of the leading Democratic candidates beat Donald Trump in a theoretical election that happens today. And I just give you an idea of how that runs. By the way, what's his name?
All 25 of them?
Yes. No, they're just showing the leading candidates, really. Okay. So the top winner over President Trump is Beto O'Rourke, who wins by a margin of 52 to 42. Next best. Okay. The next best is either Joe Biden at 51-45 or Bernie Sanders at 50-44. The only one who really loses to Trump, and that's by a razor-thin 1%, is Betsy Warren. So Senator Elizabeth Warren. And so I know immediately the right is going to hit this survey and say, well, first of all, it's registered voters, not likely voters. Okay. Secondly, we are so far out of in front of the election that it's totally meaningless. Thirdly, the sampling error, margin of sampling error is supposed to be 3.8%. But if you do the breakdown, the crosstabs, as they say, 33% identify as Democrat, 26% identify as GOP, and 41% identify as independent, and we know who those independents really are. So, Bill, do you want to restate any of those points, or would you like to go on to something else?
I think, given those numbers, I suppose that the sample base was the number of likely voters among British editorial writers.
The story is being reported in the Daily Mail. The poll was done by CNN and SSRS.
I don't care. It's absurd. It's absolutely absurd. There's 7 people beat Donald Trump. Beto beats him by how much?
52 to 42, 10%.
Sure.
10 points.
Sure, 52 to 42. Absolutely, 52 to 42. I cannot remember if there's ever been a 52 to 42 election in America. I don't think Ronald Reagan had that margin of victory, did he? Nothing like it. He won all 50 states, but he didn't. The popular vote numbers, as if that mattered, were nothing like that. It's you might as well just say that a Looney Tunes cartoon came out saying that these guys are going to beat Trump by a big margin, and then push the button and wait for the earth-shattering kaboom. It's ridiculous.
The former mayor, or maybe he's current, I forget whether he is or not, Pete Buttigieg from South Bend, Indiana, actually edges out Trump 47 to 44, a bigger margin than Hillary Clinton beat President Trump back in 2016.
So I made
a note here that said, Bill, the Republicans can either react to this, they can ignore it, or they can mock it. Which one?
I'm going to go with 3.
So
you get the idea.
So this story was posted to the front page of the Drudge Report. It wasn't I don't think it was a banner headline, but it was one of the headlines on the Drudge Report, and that's how I found it. But it's a CNN poll in cooperation with some polling organization they work with. This is going to draw attention, whether you think there are flaws in the sampling or the margin or who was polled or the ridiculousness of the outcome. So don't we at least owe those people who see this and say, wow, Beto O'Rourke's campaign has really caught fire, don't we owe them a rational, logical, humane response?
Well, if they were, we would owe it to them if they were rational, logical, humane people. But if they were, they wouldn't be voting for Beto.
Now, there are a lot of Texans who voted for Beto O'Rourke. Speaking as a Texan, I would say that that's nothing to be sniffed at.
No, but that's also like saying there are more Texans in Texas than in the entire state of Rhode Island. There
are more Californians in Texas than the population of Rhode Island.
Well, I have no doubt about that. If there was ever a lesson about polls, then I would have to go all the way back to, I think I'd have to go back to the presidential election of, it was 2016. Yeah, I remember now.
I could just see you plying the depths of your memory there, trying
Yeah,
to
you could
conjure
see me
that.
teeing up that joke a little longer than it needed. So, first of all, the numbers are ridiculous. They're just plain ridiculous. The poll, if you're going to come out with a poll with those kind of numbers, where Beto O'Rourke beats Donald Trump by 10 points or 8 or whatever.
10.
Okay, so just everything that's connected to the rest of this stuff, at least in terms of that poll, is just hooey. Now this latest poll says what?
It says, well, this is the poll from CNN and SSRS.
Is this the one? Is this the one that they ran on the Daily Mirror?
They average.
Okay.
They interviewed 1,007 registered voters, not likely voters, but registered voters.
Would those be 1,007 registered voters inside the CNN building in Atlanta? Is that where they took their sample from?
So, well, allegedly they made phone calls. They could have called using the intranet, I guess, in the CNN building. But my guess is that this polling organization values its reputation and would rather have results that are closely mirror reality.
Which was the polling company?
SSRS is the name of the company. So I'm going to pull up that and see who that is. Oh, their name stands for SSRS.
Socialist Students of Revolution Society.
Yes, they're based out of Glen Mills, Pennsylvania.
Okay,
so you know it's got to be good.
So it's yeah. They also make maple syrup.
And it looks like they've been polling this since at least January of 2017.
Wow. Okay then.
They do approval polls.
Must be true.
But here's the point. Here's the point, Bill, though. Because let's say 41% of these people that they interviewed, of the 1,007 registered voters that they interviewed, claim to be independents, not Democrats, not Republicans. Let's say 75% of those people are actually not independents, but Democrats who don't like to claim the mantle of the Democratic Party. Let's say 90% of them. Let's say 100% of them are actually Democrats, but they don't like to register that way.
Okay.
Nevertheless, Bill, this may be a reflection of the populace in the country. If you call 1,000 registered voters and 74% of them, 33 Democrats, 41 independents, are essentially against you, if you're a Republican, don't you have a problem?
I would have a problem if Scott Rasmussen gave me that number. But no, I don't. I just don't. I don't believe any of it. First of all, as you say, they're polling registered voters as opposed to likely voters. That right there is a fundamental flaw in the methodology that simply means everything that follows is bunk. You remember? Look, I was also told there'd be no math on this show, but you remember in math the idea of significant figures. And a significant figure is that if you have a number like 3.276984 plus 2.675924 plus 2.0, then all of the other figures become irrelevant because you're multiplying by a number that is not known to that degree of precision. So you can have a stack of numbers that go out 9 digits, and if you're doing a multiplication or something and one of the numbers goes to 1 point past the decimal point, that is the total amount of accuracy that you can have because that's the number of significant figures. So this kind of poll reminds me of that in the sense that when you start a poll by saying we polled 1,000 registered voters, okay. So here's really what the two possibilities are. One of them is that CNN has managed to poll 1,000 registered voters who accurately reflect the national trends of likely voters and that the sample bias is perfect. I'm going to assign a probability to this of 0.15%. The other possibility is that CNN, like everybody else looking at the board, realizes that the Democrats are in such deep trouble that if they don't start pumping some oxygen into this sputtering patient, then they're not even going to make it to the operating room.
So you're calling this a bald-faced push poll on the part of CNN?
That's precisely what I'm calling it. Yes, thank you. I couldn't have come up with a better term myself. That's exactly what I'm calling it.
So
it's exactly what I'm calling it. And this is from the agency that gave Hillary Clinton debate answers in advance on the fair and even debate that was held on CNN. This is the organization that doesn't have a single Republican anywhere. In fact, the entire wasn't it the press room, Scott, the White House press room? I don't know how many people are in that. It's like 50 or something, and there was not a Republican in the group or something like this. If this had happened in 19, even as late as maybe like the 90s, I'd be worried about this. But when you see how much hash the networks and CNN especially, when you see how much hash they sling for the Democrats, I just laugh. I mean, I really do. There are so many more things that I would take more seriously than this poll. The whole point to me is interesting only because it is an indication of how far out in the weeds this so-called news agency really is. Furthermore, it's also an indication of how desperate they are to shore up their side, because as I say, if you are starting with 1,000 registered voters and the whole thing looks like it's leaning very heavily towards the Democrats, my first question isn't whether or not moderates are being accurately represented. My question is how many of these people are dead? How many of the people on the list are deceased, not on the voting rolls anymore? How many Mickey Mouses and Babe Ruths are on that list of people that they call for this so-called scientific sample? I don't believe it. And you don't believe it. And nobody believes it, except for people who feel like they have to be in the business of influencing public opinion, and that's what CNN is. They're not a news organization. They're a publicity firm. And once you understand that, everything gets crystal clear.
Well, let's say, let's just stipulate that a poll of registered voters is inherently flawed because that doesn't reflect likely voters, and likely voters are the ones from which the subset of actual voters are drawn.
Let me interrupt for 1 second because I think this is a critical point. I don't remember. Do you remember what the polls were showing the day before the election?
I do not.
It was something like a 5-6 point lead for Hillary, right? Some statistically significant lead, may have been more. Okay, and when people say, "How could the polls have been so wrong?" my response was, "Well, the polls are so wrong because polls measure likely voters, and Donald Trump was elected by unlikely voters, and therein lies the power of Donald Trump. Trump." The guy could not be more perfectly named. I mean, he is a wild card that does not fit into any of these categories. Donald Trump rode in out of nowhere, beat 16 strong Republican, well, many of them strong anyway, Republican challengers, became the nominee and became the president because he appealed to people who had been so fed up with things like CNN polls and the absolute bland assurance that Hillary Clinton was going to win this thing and all the rest of it. I just don't believe any of it. Now, what is interesting and what I did see in 2016 that encouraged me, but not enough, because I got to tell you, I bought into this whole line too. I didn't think Donald Trump was going to win. I really didn't. I wanted him to very much, but I didn't think he was going to. Having had my heart broken so many times before. But what's interesting about the 2016 election is not what these professionals were saying in terms of poll results. What really got my attention was the fact that Donald Trump was filling up a stadium with 30,000 people and turning 25,000 people away. And Hillary Clinton would be in a gymnasium someplace, and she got 80 people to attend a national rally in the weeks leading up to the election. This is Hillary Clinton. That is a very interesting indication of what's going to happen. Now, you pointed this out yourself, Scott. You pointed out during the run-up to the 2018 elections, you said that you didn't say that Beto, did I say beta? Slip of the tongue. You didn't say that Beto O'Rourke's polling numbers are really strong. What you said was that he's getting a very enthusiastic response wherever he goes, that his rallies are on fire. And that tells me something. And what it tells me was, okay, there are people that are really excited about this, and so this might be a real challenge. Turns out that it was a real challenge, but it still was a loss. And so I'm going to be really interested in seeing how many. Look, I already have a fair number, a fair estimation of what Donald Trump's 2020 pre-election rallies are going to look like. You know, they're going to be in Dodger Stadium. There's going to be 40,000 people in there, or full, one or the other. Now the question is Kamala Harris going to get that kind of numbers? And is Beto going to get those kind of numbers? I don't think so. Because when you really get down to it, it's not even likelihood of voting. It really, if I understand the history of this correctly, what ultimately comes down to is voter enthusiasm. How motivated are you to get out and vote? And one of the reasons that Donald Trump beat Hillary Clinton was that a number of these incredibly politically engaged millennials realized that Bernie Sanders wasn't running, in fact, had been cheated out of several of the primaries. So they decided to sleep in that day.
Well, because we can't measure actual voters until sometimes weeks or months after an election occurs, and for Democrats, you can't actually measure them ever.
I know I hate to keep doing this, but why don't we just put a period right there, okay? Because what you really have done there is you've addressed the entire polling issue in a nutshell. We really cannot measure what voters are going to do. In fact, we can't even really measure what they did until a few months after it's happened. So all of it is tea leaves and chicken entrails and eclipses and all the rest. Now, it's not to say that there's not some scientific basis for it. And I think that if you have a wide spectrum of differently politically aligned polls, and they're all showing a significant lead, then I do think that represents something real. But I didn't mean to interrupt you, but honestly, the idea that there's going to be a poll that's going to tell us what's going to happen is nuts. And this is why polls are so effective, Scott, and this is why we're talking about polls and so on. It's because the human mind can tolerate almost anything better than uncertainty. We would rather know that something this is why people worry. This is kind of the definition of worry. We prepare ourselves for the worst case scenario because we would rather chew on the worst case scenario than have uncertainty about what is actually going to happen. And that's why polls exist. And frankly, that's why this business exists as well.
Well, and I'm not suggesting that this poll tells us anything about an actual future event. What I am suggesting is that it provides some kind of data to help us understand the atmosphere, the environment of this election. So let me press this point here, Bill, because what it sounds like sometimes when you're talking is that the Republican Party is becoming the party of hoping they don't show up, and that we are building or trying to build election victories around exclusion rather than inclusion. Basically, and I've seen this myself on the local level, where I was told by relatively high-ranking political elected officials that you're wasting your time going to downtown Allentown, for example, because those people will never vote for you. And it seems like the GOP has bought into this idea of, well, screw the registered voters. Those people aren't going to show up. Not even the likely voters are going to show up. All we have to worry about is those unlikely voters. And these polls give us no information. Are you really saying there's no data here to be considered?
Well, there's a couple questions in there. First of all, you and I have had many private conversations about this particular subject, and you and I agree completely that for any Republican, Mitt Romney, perfect example, 47% of the country's gone, we'll never get them. What? And the 2008 campaign, McCain says, 3 weeks before the election, we're not going to get Pennsylvania. Sarah Palin says, well, maybe we should campaign harder. So this idea of just giving up on these things and running the numbers and hoping for a low turnout is a legitimate criticism. But to say that the GOP is dependent on low turnouts it makes it sound like a strategy. It's not a strategy. Every election is determined by which side is going to turn out the most voters. That's the simple math of it. And the more excited the side is, the more likely they are to turn out voters. And that's what's the only thing that's measurable in terms of likelihood of a win. I'm very glad, though, that you said that this is affecting the environment of the political race, because we talked about this a minute ago. This is the problem of having just a little tiny little scientific education. One of the problems with with numbers and statistics is where is the uncertainty? And the reason I said I'm glad you mentioned this in terms of the environment, you'll hear people say that 90,000 scientists have confirmed that global warming is real. Now, that would be a tremendously damning statistic if 90,000 experiments were using 90,000 completely fresh data sets that had been individually sampled from all around the world. But when you find out that there is essentially one, if not maybe two sets of numbers, there's NOAA and East Anglia, and you find out that all of the stuff downstream, 90,000 people, 900,000 people, maybe there's 9 billion people that have shown that this is going to happen. But when all of that is downstream of a bottleneck that consists of one or two sets of data, which has already been shown to be messed around with in terms of emails and adjusted and stuff. I'm not trying to make this into a global warming issue. What I'm trying to say is that your fundamental assumption has to be correct, and it has to be robust, and it has to be varied. And when you talk about a poll made by CNN that shows that Beto O'Rourke beats Donald Trump by 10 points, you've gone beyond stretching credibility now.
Well, and let me jump in here because I really have stretched the elasticity of this poll far beyond the breaking point. But I do want to ask what may be the only relevant question of this. Let's just assume it's a push poll. Let's assume and stipulate that it's been wildly skewed by sampling margins that are beyond the 3.8% that they say exists. If you look at the internals of the poll, we see that the candidate whose candidacy is premised upon his electability, former Senator, former Vice President Joe Biden, actually finishes 1 point down from Beto O'Rourke and without as large a margin between him and the sitting president of the United States. Does this revive Beto's main question, which is his electability, and does this really kind of put a damper on the whole premise of the Biden campaign? So
let me make sure I understand this. You're saying that this poll shows that Biden comes in 1 point under Beto, but still beats Trump by 9 points or 8 points?
No, he beats him 51-45. So there's 6 point margin between Biden and Trump, but there's a 10 point margin at 52-42 between Beto and Trump.
Scott, just between you and me, everybody else, please turn down your speakers at home just for a moment so I can have a personal conversation with my friend here. Do you think that Joe Biden is going to beat Donald Trump by 6 points?
That's not the question I'm asking. It has nothing to do with President Trump. What I'm asking you is the electability of these two candidates, one of which was assumed to be highly electable and was leading by 20 points, and the other who was not.
My point, though, is if I ask you if you think Joe Biden's going to beat Donald Trump with a 4%, 5% economic growth and all the rest of those things, if you actually think that creepy Uncle Joe the gropester, who slurred his way through his announcement speech, is going to beat Donald Trump by 6 points. If you believe that, then anything that comes downstream of that is irrelevant because you'll believe anything.
I'm talking about who's going to get the Democrat nomination.
Okay, so but this is my point, Scott. It's like this kind of a poll is so far. When you hear something like that, like Joe Biden's going to win by 6-7 points over Donald Trump, when you hear something like that, you realize that it's not just you're pulling individual points out of this poll. Well, okay, maybe. Well, what about these two? What about these two? I'm saying the poll is like a bingo game where they just put in all of these things and just spun the wheel around and just randomly plop things down. There's no data to get there. There's no data that can be extracted from something that ridiculous. It's just pointless. I will say one thing just to wrap up our little science lesson here. When I was, I want to say in the mid-'70s, when I started really getting seriously into astronomy, there was something being promoted called the Drake equation. And the Drake equation was a long equation that was going to determine what the chances of finding intelligent life in the universe was. And I was blown away by this. Finally, somebody's figured it out. So the first part is the number of planets, number of stars in the solar system, number of stars that have planets, number of planets that have habitable zones, number of habitable zones that have life, and down and down and down it goes. And you get this incredibly detailed thing, and out comes a number like 4,622. And it wasn't until I was much older that somebody pointed out to me that there is no data for any of this, with the exception of the number of stars in the galaxy. That one we could get a pretty good guess at. But every single thing downstream was a shot in the dark guess. And what I'm bringing this up for is it gave you the illusion of giving you valuable information when in point of fact, what it really was just sophistry to try to assuage our sense of uncertainty about an issue when in point of fact, an equation that consists of 11 parts for which one of these 11 multipliers, one has data and the rest of them are absolutely, completely raw guesses, then that equation is worthless and it's pointless to waste time. And that's exactly what you do. You're wasting time with something that is that seriously statistically flawed. And that's how I feel about this entire thing. I think the whole thing is just a laughing stock. And when I ask you a question like, do you really think Joe Biden's going to beat Donald Trump by 6 points? What I'm basically saying is, do you believe any of this horse manure? Any of it? Because I don't.
Finding nothing where there seems to be something 5 days a week.
That's my job.
This is Bill Whittle's job here on Bill Whittle Now. We are grateful to the members at BillWhittle.com who've made it possible for us to ply this enterprise. Please join them by going to BillWhittle.com and clicking that Become a Member link. So for Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members for making it happen.